Machiavelli once wrote that cruelties can be well or badly used. Well used are those that are done all at once, out of necessity for security, and then not persisted in. I never truly understood what he meant until I found myself managing a team of 12 people at a tech startup in Austin back in 2021. I had this employee, let's call him Dave, who was consistently missing deadlines and creating a toxic atmosphere. For 3 months, I tried the nice guy approach, one-on-one meetings, performance improvement plans, even offering him additional training. I thought I was being compassionate, giving him every chance to succeed. But here's what I didn't realize at the time. My kindness was actually cruelty to everyone else. Sarah was working weekends to cover for Dave's missed deadlines. Michael had to redo Dave's sloppy work twice in 1 week. The whole team was burning out because I refused to make the hard decision. I was being cruel to 11 people to avoid being cruel to one. Then I remembered something Cesare Borgia did in the early 1500s. When he took control of Romagna, he appointed a brutal governor named Ramiro de Orco to restore order. De Orco did his job efficiently but harshly, and once peace was established, Borgia had him executed in the town square. The people cheered because Borgia had given them order, then removed the instrument of their suffering. I realized I needed to apply what Machiavelli called well-used cruelty, swift, decisive, and then stopped completely. On a Tuesday morning in March, I called Dave into my office and terminated his employment immediately. No drawn-out process, no additional chances, no emotional explanations. Just clear, direct action with a generous severance package to soften the blow. The relief in my team was immediate and visible. Within a week, productivity increased 40%. Sarah stopped looking exhausted every morning. Michael actually smiled during our Friday stand-up. I had been so afraid of being the bad guy that I'd become exactly that to the people who deserved better. That experience taught me something crucial about leadership. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is act decisively, even when it feels harsh in the moment. The fear of being perceived as cruel had made me genuinely cruel to those who were performing well. It's a lesson that applies far beyond the workplace, and I've used it in relationships, negotiations, and even family situations. What I didn't expect was how this one decision would completely change how people viewed my leadership style. Suddenly, everyone knew I was capable of making tough calls when necessary. The interesting thing is, I never had to fire anyone again. The message was clear, and standards were established. But here's where it gets really interesting. I learned that there's a specific psychology behind why this approach works so effectively. Most people think being decisive is about confidence, but there's actually a deeper neurological reason why our brains respond better to swift, clear actions than to prolonged uncertainty. The key was understanding when to apply pressure and when to release it completely. After that decisive action with Dave, I became more supportive and encouraging with my remaining team members than I'd ever been before. They earned that support by meeting clear expectations, and the contrast made my praise even more meaningful. I've seen other managers struggle with this same issue. They either avoid difficult decisions entirely, or they become consistently harsh with everyone. Both approaches fail because they don't understand Machiavelli's core insight about timing and intensity. The cruelty must be concentrated, purposeful, and then completely stopped. Looking back, I realized that moment changed not just how I managed people, but how I approached every difficult situation in my life. The principle extends far beyond the workplace. It's about having the courage to endure short-term discomfort to prevent long-term suffering for everyone involved. But mastering the timing of when to be firm versus when to be flexible requires understanding something even more fundamental about human nature, something I discovered when I had to deal with a completely different kind of challenge involving someone I considered a close friend. Machiavelli observed that princes who try to avoid giving offense often end up causing the most harm to their subjects. I thought this was just political theory until my friendship with Jake taught me how devastating excessive kindness can actually be. Jake and I had been close since college, but by 2020, our friendship had become something I dreaded rather than enjoyed. It started small, like these things always do. Jake would show up to dinner 45 minutes late without calling, leaving me sitting alone at restaurants feeling like an idiot. When I'd mention it later, he'd give me some elaborate excuse about traffic or work, and I'd just smile and say, "No worries, man." I thought I was being a good friend by not making it a big deal. Then it escalated. He'd cancel plans at the last minute via text, sometimes when I was already in the Uber heading to meet him. Once, he bailed on my birthday dinner 30 minutes before we were supposed to meet, claiming he'd totally forgotten about a work deadline. I felt humiliated having to call everyone else to reschedule, but I told myself he was going through a tough time at his job. The breaking point came when he asked to borrow $3,000 for what he called a temporary cash flow issue. Against my better judgment, I lent him the money because I didn't want to seem like I didn't trust him. 6 months later, when I gently brought up repayment, he acted shocked that I'd even mention it. "I thought that was more of a gift between friends," he said with a straight face. I realized my kindness had actually trained Jake to disrespect me completely. By never establishing consequences for his behavior, I'd taught him that my time, feelings, and money didn't matter. What I thought was being supportive was actually enabling him to become a worse person, and a worse friend to others too. His girlfriend Lisa later told me he'd started pulling the same stuff with her. This reminded me of something I'd read about Adam Newman at WeWork. For years, he avoided firing incompetent executives because he didn't want to destroy families. His compassion ended up destroying thousands of families when the company imploded, burning through $12 billion and forcing massive layoffs. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is refuse to be cruel when the situation demands it. I decided to apply what I'd learned from that experience with Dave at work. I called Jake and said something I'd never said to a friend before. "Your pattern of canceling plans and disrespecting my time has made me realize I can't count on you for anything important. Until that changes, I'm not making plans with you anymore." No anger, no long explanation, just a clear boundary with a clear consequence. His reaction was exactly what I expected. He got defensive, called me uptight, and tried to make me feel guilty for changing and becoming transactional about friendship. But here's what I noticed over the next few months. He started showing up on time for other people. His girlfriend told me their relationship improved dramatically. My clear boundary had actually helped him become more reliable across the board. The hardest part wasn't setting the boundary, it was sticking to it when he'd occasionally reach out with invitations. For about 3 months, I had to keep saying no, even when the event sounded fun. It felt cold and calculated, but I knew that any exceptions would signal that my boundary wasn't real. Consistency was everything in this situation. What surprised me was how much my other friendships improved once I stopped accepting disrespectful behavior. My friend Marcus commented that I seemed more confident and decisive. Sarah, who I'd been dating casually, mentioned that she appreciated how I was clear about my expectations. Setting one firm boundary had apparently shifted how people perceived me across the board. About 6 months later, Jake reached out with a genuine apology and acknowledgement of his past behavior. We slowly rebuilt our friendship, but on completely different terms. He knew I wouldn't tolerate disrespect, so he didn't test those limits anymore. Our friendship became more honest and ultimately much stronger because I'd been willing to risk losing it entirely. The experience taught me that people often interpret your tolerance of their bad behavior as weakness rather than kindness. They don't respect you more for accepting mistreatment, they respect you less. And ironically, they often become worse people because they're not getting the feedback they need to grow and improve their behavior with others. This principle applies everywhere: parenting, management, romantic relationships, even dealing with difficult family members. The people who care about you will ultimately appreciate clear boundaries, even if they push back initially. The people who don't care about you will reveal themselves quickly when you stop accepting their disrespect. But knowing when to set boundaries and when to show flexibility requires understanding something deeper about human psychology, particularly how people test your resolve and what those tests really mean about their intentions toward you. Machiavelli wrote extensively about Cesare Borgia's brilliant use of what he called well-employed cruelty, swift, decisive action followed by complete restraint. I never fully grasped the genius of this strategy until I found myself in a leadership crisis that threatened to destroy everything I'd built over 3 years. Sometimes you have to study the masters to understand how power really works. In early 2022, I was running a small marketing agency in Denver with 8 employees. We'd grown steadily, but I was facing a situation that reminded me exactly of what Borgia dealt with in Romagna back in 1501. Just like that Italian province was plagued by petty warlords and chaos, my company was being torn apart by internal politics and incompetence that I'd let fester for way too long. My Ramiro de Orco moment came when I realized that 3 of my employees, let's call them Brian, Jessica, and Tom, had formed what I can only describe as a toxic alliance. They were undermining projects, spreading negativity, and creating an us versus them atmosphere that was poisoning the entire workplace. The other 5 employees were miserable, and I was losing clients because of declining work quality. For months, I'd tried the diplomatic approach: individual meetings, team building, exercises, even bringing in an outside consultant to address communication issues. I was trying to be the reasonable boss who could solve everything through better processes and understanding. But just like those Italian nobles who thought they could negotiate with chaos, I was making everything worse by refusing to act decisively. Then I read about how Borgia handled his problem. When he took control of Romagna, he appointed Diorco as his enforcer, someone brutal enough to restore order quickly. Diorco did exactly that, using harsh methods to eliminate the troublemakers and establish clear rules. But here's the brilliant part. Once order was restored, Borgia publicly executed Diorco in the town square, satisfying the people's desire for justice while distancing himself from the harsh methods. I realized I needed my own version of this strategy. On a Monday morning in March, I called all 3 troublemakers into separate meetings and terminated them within 2 hours of each other. No long explanations, no attempts to rehabilitate them, no gradual improvement plans. I offered generous severance packages and professional references, but they were gone that same day. It was the most decisive action I'd ever taken as a leader. The immediate reaction from my remaining team was exactly what Borgia probably saw in Romagna: relief mixed with a healthy respect for my ability to take tough action. Sarah, my lead designer, actually said thank God when I announced the departures. Within a week, the entire atmosphere had changed. People were collaborating again, deadlines were being met, and I could see the stress leaving everyone's faces. But here's where I applied the second part of Borgia's strategy. After that swift, decisive action, I completely changed my leadership style with the remaining team. I became more supportive, more collaborative, and more generous with praise and opportunities. Just like Borgia distanced himself from Diorco's harsh methods, I made sure my team knew that the firings were an exception, not my normal management style. The results were immediate and measurable. Within 3 months, our client satisfaction scores increased by 60%. We landed 2 major contracts that we'd been competing for unsuccessfully. Most importantly, the 5 remaining employees were happier and more productive than they'd ever been. I'd learned that sometimes you have to clear out the poison before you can nurture the healthy growth. What impressed me most was how this one decisive action changed everyone's perception of my leadership. Suddenly, I had credibility when I made decisions or set expectations. People knew I was capable of taking tough action when necessary, which paradoxically made me more effective when I was being supportive and encouraging. The contrast made both approaches more powerful. The experience taught me that there's a crucial difference between being harsh and being decisive. Borgia wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was strategic about when to apply pressure and when to release it. The key is concentrating your firm actions into specific moments, rather than being consistently difficult or consistently permissive with everyone. Looking back, I realized this wasn't just about management. It was about understanding that real leadership sometimes requires you to be the person who makes the hard decisions others can't or won't make. You have to be willing to accept temporary unpopularity to create long-term stability and success for everyone involved. But mastering this kind of decisive leadership is only part of the equation. What I discovered next was that even when you make the right tough decisions, you still have to deal with the psychology of the people around you, particularly how they test your resolve and what those tests reveal about power dynamics. Machiavelli warned that princes who seek to avoid giving offense often bring about their own destruction and harm their subjects in the process. I learned this lesson the hard way when I watched my mentor, David, lose everything he'd built over 20 years because he couldn't bring himself to make the tough decisions that leadership demanded. Sometimes the people we admire most teach us the most important lessons through their failures. David was the CEO of a mid-sized software company in Portland when I started working there as a junior developer in 2018. Everyone loved him. He was the kind of boss who remembered your kids' names, never raised his voice, and genuinely seemed to care about every employee's well-being. For the first year, I thought he was the perfect leader. He'd built a company culture where people actually enjoyed coming to work. But by 2019, I started noticing cracks in his approach. We had this VP of sales, Frank, who was clearly incompetent, missing targets by 30%, losing major clients, and creating chaos in his department. Instead of addressing the problem directly, David kept trying to support Frank with additional training, new team members, and revised strategies. He told me privately that Frank had 3 kids and a mortgage, so he felt terrible about the idea of letting him go. Meanwhile, our best salespeople were jumping ship to competitors. 2 of them told me directly that they were frustrated watching Frank get chance after chance while they were hitting their numbers and not getting promoted. David's kindness to one person was driving away the performers who actually deserved his loyalty. But he was so focused on avoiding conflict that he couldn't see the bigger picture. The situation reminded me of King Louis XVI of France, who spent years avoiding difficult reforms because he didn't want to upset the nobility or burden the common people with taxes. His excessive desire to please everyone meant he never addressed the fundamental problems, and eventually the whole system collapsed in revolution. Sometimes trying to protect everyone means you end up protecting no one. By late 2019, our company was hemorrhaging talent and losing market share. I could see what was coming, but David still couldn't bring himself to make the hard call on Frank. Instead, he kept hoping things would somehow improve naturally. He'd schedule more meetings about alignment and strategic focus, but he refused to address the root cause of our problems. The end came in early 2020, right as the pandemic hit. Our largest client, who represented 40% of our revenue, terminated their contract, specifically citing poor service from Frank's team. With the economic uncertainty, David finally had to lay off 30 people, including Frank, but also including a bunch of talented developers and designers who had nothing to do with the sales problems. Watching David deliver those layoff notices was heartbreaking. He was crying as he spoke to people who trusted him, explaining that the company couldn't afford to keep them. The irony was devastating. His attempt to avoid causing pain to one incompetent executive had resulted in genuine suffering for 30 families who had done nothing wrong. What made it worse was seeing how the remaining employees reacted. Instead of rallying around David during a tough time, they lost confidence in his leadership completely. Sarah from marketing told me she couldn't respect a boss who would sacrifice good people to protect bad ones. The culture he'd spent years building crumbled in a matter of weeks. I learned something crucial watching David's company fall apart. There's a massive difference between being kind and being weak. True kindness sometimes requires you to cause short-term pain to prevent long-term disaster. David's inability to hurt one person's feelings ultimately hurt dozens of families much more severely. The company never recovered. David ended up selling it for a fraction of what it was worth before the Frank situation spiraled out of control. Last I heard, he was working as a consultant, still struggling with the confidence to make tough decisions. His greatest strength, his empathy, had become his greatest weakness because he never learned to balance it with decisive action. This experience completely changed how I think about leadership and responsibility. When you're in charge, being nice isn't always the same thing as being good. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is be firm with people who aren't meeting standards, both for their sake and for everyone else who's counting on you to maintain quality and fairness. But understanding when to be firm versus when to be flexible requires reading people's psychology much more carefully than I'd ever realized. The next situation I found myself in taught me that there are specific ways people test your resolve, and how you respond to those tests determines everything about how they'll treat you going forward. Machiavelli understood something profound about human nature, that people actually feel more secure under firm, predictable leadership than under inconsistent kindness. I didn't believe this until I started noticing my own physical reactions to different types of leaders. My body was literally telling me which leadership styles felt safe and which ones triggered my stress response, even when my mind thought the opposite. Back in 2020, I was consulting for 2 different companies within the same month, and the contrast was striking. The first CEO, Amanda, was what everyone called a people person. She avoided conflict, rarely gave direct feedback, and seemed to change her mind based on whoever she'd spoken to last. The second CEO, Marcus, was known for being tough but fair, clear expectations, immediate consequences, and completely consistent in his standards. Here's what fascinated me. Every morning when I walked into Amanda's office building, I'd feel this low-level anxiety in my stomach. I never knew what version of Amanda I'd get that day, or whether the project priorities from last week would still matter. My shoulders would literally tense up before meetings because I couldn't predict what she'd want or how she'd react to different ideas. But walking into Marcus's building felt completely different. Even though he was much more demanding and direct than Amanda, I felt calm and focused. I knew exactly what he expected, what would happen if I delivered, and what would happen if I didn't. That predictability was actually relaxing, even though the standards were higher and the consequences were real. I started researching this phenomenon and discovered that Dr. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford had studied something similar in primates. He found that monkeys under inconsistent leadership had cortisol levels that were 340% higher than those under firm, predictable leadership. Our brains are literally wired to prefer clear rules and consistent enforcement over unpredictable kindness. This explained so much about my own career experiences. The bosses I'd respected most weren't necessarily the nicest ones. They were the ones who set clear boundaries and stuck to them. When I knew exactly where I stood and what was expected, I could focus all my energy on performing rather than trying to read the political winds or guess what mood my boss might be in. I decided to test this theory on myself by implementing what I called the 10-second rule. Whenever I felt the urge to avoid a difficult conversation or decision, I'd count to 10 and ask myself, what will this cost if I wait 30 more days? Almost every time, the answer made it clear that avoiding the discomfort now would create much bigger problems later. The physical signals became easier to recognize once I started paying attention. That knot in my stomach when I thought about postponing a tough conversation. The way I'd avoid eye contact with someone I needed to address. The procrastination around tasks that involved potential conflict. My body was trying to tell me when I was choosing short-term comfort over long-term effectiveness. What really convinced me was seeing how other people responded when I started being more direct and consistent. Instead of being offended or hurt, most people seemed relieved. My assistant Jennifer told me she appreciated always knowing where she stood with me. My business partner Steve said our meetings had become much more productive since I'd started addressing issues immediately instead of letting them build up. The breakthrough moment came when I realized that being nice by avoiding difficult conversations was actually a form of selfishness. I was prioritizing my own comfort over giving people the feedback they needed to improve. I was choosing to feel good about myself in the moment rather than helping others succeed in the long run. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. Parents who couldn't set boundaries with their kids, managers who let problems fester rather than addressing them, friends who avoided honest conversations about relationship issues. In every case, the person thought they were being kind, but they were actually being cruel by denying others the clarity they needed to make better choices. The most powerful realization was understanding that strategic firmness actually creates more space for genuine kindness. When people know you'll address problems directly, they trust your praise and support more. When Marcus complimented my work, it meant something because I knew he wouldn't hesitate to tell me if something wasn't up to standard. But learning to read when people are testing your resolve versus when they're genuinely struggling requires a completely different set of skills. Skills I had to develop the hard way when I found myself in a situation where someone was deliberately pushing my boundaries to see how much they could get away with. Machiavelli taught that a prince must be feared and loved, but if you can only choose one, fear is more reliable than love. I learned exactly what he meant during my first management role at a fintech startup in Chicago, where I had to deal with someone who was systematically undermining my authority and testing every boundary I tried to establish. The situation taught me that sometimes you have to demonstrate consequences before people will take your standards seriously. Her name was Rebecca, and she'd been with the company for 2 years before I was brought in as the new operations manager in early 2021. On paper, she was talented, good technical skills, decent output when she focused. But within my first week, I noticed she had this pattern of arriving 20 to 30 minutes late every single day, always with elaborate excuses about subway delays or apartment emergencies. At first, I tried the collaborative approach. I pulled her aside for a private conversation about punctuality, explaining how her tardiness affected team meetings and project timelines. She nodded, apologized sincerely, and promised to do better. For exactly 3 days, she showed up on time. Then she was back to her old pattern, this time with new excuses about her roommate's car troubles and unexpected plumbing issues. I realized she was testing me. Every excuse was carefully crafted to be just plausible enough that calling her out would make me seem unreasonable. She was smart about it. She'd arrived just as we were wrapping up the daily stand-up, forcing me to either restart the meeting for her benefit or let her miss important information. It was a power play disguised as personal struggles. The breaking point came during our third week working together. Rebecca strolled in 45 minutes late to a client presentation meeting, interrupting my explanation of our Q2 projections to announce that her train had been delayed by a medical emergency. The client looked annoyed, my team looked embarrassed, and I knew that everyone was watching to see how I'd handle this obvious lie. After the meeting, I scheduled a formal conversation with Rebecca for the next morning at 9 a.m. sharp. I'd learned from watching other managers make the mistake of being vague about consequences, so I prepared exactly what I was going to say. When she arrived 15 minutes late to our meeting about punctuality, I knew she was deliberately pushing to see if I'd actually follow through on any threats. I looked her in the eye and said, "Rebecca, your pattern of lateness is affecting the entire team's productivity and my ability to run effective meetings. Starting tomorrow, if you're not at your desk ready to work by 9 a.m., you'll receive a formal written warning. 3 warnings result in termination. This policy starts immediately and applies every single day going forward." Her reaction was exactly what I expected. She got defensive, started explaining all the legitimate reasons for her tardiness, and tried to make me feel unreasonable for not being more understanding about her circumstances. I listened politely, then repeated the exact same consequence. On time by 9 a.m. or formal documentation. No negotiation, no special considerations, no room for interpretation. The next morning, Rebecca tested my resolve one more time. She arrived at 9:07, clearly watching to see if I'd really follow through on my threat over 7 minutes. I immediately sent her a formal email documenting the tardiness, copying HR, and reminding her that this was warning number 1 of 3. The email took me about 2 minutes to write, but its impact lasted for months. From that day forward, Rebecca was never late again. But more importantly, the entire team's dynamic shifted. People started arriving on time without me having to say anything. Project deadlines were met more consistently. My other direct reports began taking my feedback and requests more seriously because they'd seen that my words had actual weight behind them. What surprised me most was how Rebecca's overall performance improved once she knew I'd enforce boundaries consistently. When she wasn't spending mental energy testing my limits, she focused that energy on actually doing good work. Within 6 months, she'd become one of my most reliable team members, and she later told me she appreciated working for someone who had clear, consistent expectations. The experience taught me that people don't just test your boundaries to see if they can get away with things. They test boundaries to see if you're a leader they can trust and respect. When you fail to enforce standards, you signal that you're either not paying attention or not capable of maintaining order. Either way, you lose credibility with everyone who's watching. But mastering workplace boundaries is just one piece of the puzzle. The skills I developed dealing with Rebecca's professional testing behavior turned out to be incredibly valuable when I had to navigate much more personal and emotionally charged situations in my relationships outside of work. Machiavelli observed that in personal alliances, as in politics, people will test your resolve to determine how much respect you deserve. I learned this lesson painfully through my friendship with my college roommate Mike, who had developed a pattern of treating me like his personal emergency contact and backup plan. The situation taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their disrespectful behavior. Mike and I had been close since our freshman year at Northwestern, but by 2019, our friendship had become completely one-sided. He'd call me at random hours asking for favors. Could I pick him up from the airport at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday? Could I cover his portion of our fantasy football league buy-in? Could I help him move apartments with 2 days' notice? I always said yes because I thought that's what good friends do. The pattern escalated when he started treating me like his personal crisis manager. He'd disappear for weeks without responding to texts, then suddenly call in a panic needing something urgent. Once he asked me to lie to his girlfriend about where he'd been the night before. Another time, he wanted me to co-sign a loan for a motorcycle he definitely couldn't afford. Each request was presented as if I was the only person who could help him. What really opened my eyes was watching how he treated our mutual friend David versus how he treated me. When David said no to something, Mike would accept it immediately and move on. But when I set any kind of boundary, Mike would push back with guilt trips about our history and how he'd do the same for me. I realized he was treating me differently because I'd trained him to believe my boundaries were negotiable. The breaking point came when he asked me to cover his rent for 2 months while he got back on his feet after quitting another job impulsively. This wasn't a small favor. We were talking about $2,400 from someone he barely stayed in touch with unless he needed something. When I hesitated, he actually said, "I thought you were my friend, man." I realized I had to apply the same principle I'd learned with Rebecca at work. Mike was testing whether I valued his approval more than my own self-respect. Every time I said yes to an unreasonable request, I was teaching him that he could treat me with less consideration than he showed to people who regularly said no to him. So I said something I'd never said to him before. "Mike, I'm not going to cover your rent. More importantly, I'm not going to be available for these kinds of requests anymore. You only contact me when you need something, and that's not a friendship I'm interested in maintaining." No long explanation, no apology for being selfish, just a clear boundary with a clear consequence. His reaction was immediate and revealing. He got angry, called me uptight, and said I'd changed since college. He tried to make me feel guilty for abandoning him during a difficult time, but what struck me was that he didn't seem surprised. It was almost like he'd been waiting to see how long I'd keep accepting his disrespect before I finally pushed back. Over the next few months, something interesting happened. Mike stopped reaching out entirely at first, which honestly felt like a relief. But around 6 months later, he called just to catch up. No favors, no emergencies, just wanting to talk. When we did hang out, he was more considerate about my time and more reciprocal in our conversations. He'd actually learned to treat me better once I'd shown I wouldn't accept being treated poorly. The experience taught me that people often interpret your willingness to accept poor treatment as a sign that you don't value yourself highly. They unconsciously adjust their behavior to match what they think you'll tolerate. When you consistently accept disrespect, you're inadvertently training people to disrespect you more. What surprised me most was how setting this one clear boundary affected my other relationships. My girlfriend at the time, Lisa, mentioned that I seemed more confident and decisive. My co-workers started taking my input more seriously in meetings. Apparently, learning to value my own time and energy had made me more attractive and compelling to everyone around me. The hardest part wasn't setting the boundary with Mike. It was sticking to it when he occasionally reached out with requests during those first few months. I had to keep saying no, even when the favors seemed reasonable, because I knew that any exceptions would signal that my boundary wasn't real. Consistency was everything in rebuilding respect, but understanding when to be firm versus when to be flexible in relationships requires recognizing something deeper about human psychology, particularly how successful people think about power and influence, which I learned by studying someone who had mastered these dynamics at the highest level. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must sometimes appear harsh to maintain the respect necessary for effective governance. I never understood the genius of this approach until I started studying how Steve Jobs built Apple's culture of excellence, and then tried to apply his methods in my own consulting business. What I discovered was that his famous cruelty wasn't personal vindictiveness. It was a systematic approach to preventing mediocrity from infecting an entire organization. In 2020, I was running a small digital marketing consultancy in Seattle with 6 employees, and I was struggling with something every growing business faces: how to maintain quality standards as you scale. I'd read countless articles about jobs calling work shit directly to employees' faces, and like most people, I initially thought he was just an asshole with a god complex. But when my own company started delivering subpar work, I began to understand what he was really doing. The turning point came when one of my junior designers, Alex, submitted a logo design for our biggest client that was clearly rushed and poorly executed. My instinct was to give gentle feedback like, "Let's explore some other directions," or "I think we can push this further." But I remembered reading about how jobs would respond to work that didn't meet his standards, and I decided to try a more direct approach. I called Alex into my office and said exactly what I was thinking. "This logo is unacceptable. It looks like something you threw together in 20 minutes, and our client deserves much better. I need you to start over with a completely fresh approach. No sugarcoating, no compliment sandwich, no attempt to soften the message. Just honest, direct feedback about the quality of the work." Alex's initial reaction was shock. He'd never heard me speak that bluntly about anyone's work before. But something interesting happened over the next week. Instead of getting demoralized, he came back with 3 logo concepts that were genuinely excellent. When I praised the new work, he told me that my direct criticism had actually motivated him more than months of gentle suggestions ever had. What I learned was that Jobs' directness served 3 crucial purposes that I'd never considered. First, it was impersonal. He attacked the work, never the person. Second, it was educational. It raised everyone's understanding of what excellent work actually looked like. Third, it was consistent. There were no favorites, no exceptions, no politics involved in quality standards. I started applying this approach more systematically across my team. When someone presented work that wasn't up to standard, I'd say something like, "This doesn't represent the quality our clients expect from us. What specifically can we do to elevate this?" The key was focusing on the work itself, rather than making it about their capabilities or effort level. The results were remarkable. Within 3 months, the overall quality of our deliverables had improved dramatically. More importantly, my team started holding each other accountable for excellence without me having to say anything. They'd internalized the standards and begun applying them to their own work and their colleagues' work. What surprised me most was how this affected team morale. Instead of creating a hostile environment, the clear standards actually made everyone more confident and proud of their work. When you know that mediocre work won't be accepted, the praise for excellent work becomes much more meaningful. My team started celebrating wins more enthusiastically because they knew those wins were genuinely earned. I also noticed that we started attracting better talent. Word got around that our agency had high standards, and designers who were serious about their craft wanted to work in that kind of environment. Meanwhile, people who were comfortable with good enough work naturally selected themselves out during the interview process. The experience taught me that what people often call cruelty in successful leaders is actually a form of respect. Respect for the work, respect for the client, and ultimately, respect for the team members who are capable of doing excellent work when excellent work is expected of them. Accepting mediocrity isn't kindness, it's an insult to everyone involved. But maintaining these kinds of standards requires more than just being direct about equality. It also requires understanding how to handle the psychological pressure and resistance that comes when you refuse to accept less than people's best effort. Something I learned the hard way in my next major challenge. Machiavelli taught that in negotiations, you must be prepared to walk away completely to gain any real leverage. I learned this lesson during the most important salary negotiation of my career in 2021, when I was offered a position at a major consulting firm in Boston. What started as a routine job offer turned into a masterclass in power dynamics that completely changed how I approach every negotiation since. The initial offer was for $85,000 as a senior analyst position, which was about $15,000 less than what I knew the market rate should be for someone with my experience. My instinct was to counter with something like $90,000 and hope we could meet in the middle. But I remembered reading about how truly successful negotiators approach these situations. They don't just ask for more money, they demonstrate that they have alternatives. Before responding to their offer, I spent 2 weeks actively interviewing with 3 other companies. This wasn't just a bluff. I genuinely pursued other opportunities until I had 2 competing offers in hand. One was for $92,000 at a smaller firm, and another was for $88,000 at a startup with equity upside. Now I had real leverage, not just wishful thinking about my worth. When I finally called the hiring manager, Jennifer, I didn't start by asking for more money. Instead, I said, "I'm very interested in this position, but I need to be transparent with you. Based on my research and other opportunities I'm considering, the market rate for this role appears to be in the $90,000 to $95,000 range. Is there flexibility in the compensation package to reflect that?" Jennifer's response was immediate. "Let me see what I can do and get back to you." Notice that she didn't question my numbers or try to convince me that their original offer was fair. When you have genuine alternatives, people can sense it in your tone and confidence level. You're not begging for a favor. You're presenting a business case based on market realities. 3 days later, she called back with a revised offer, $94,000 base salary plus a signing bonus of $5,000. But here's where most people would have said yes immediately. I had prepared for this moment by deciding in advance what my minimum acceptable offer would be, and I stuck to that standard even when the pressure was on. I told Jennifer, "I appreciate you working with me on the base salary. However, I'm still concerned about the total compensation package compared to my other options. Would it be possible to discuss the signing bonus amount or perhaps review the vacation time policy?" I wasn't being greedy. I was being systematic about getting to a number that made sense for both parties. The final offer was $96,000 base with an $8,000 signing bonus, plus an extra week of vacation time. More importantly, I'd established myself as someone who knew my value and wasn't afraid to advocate for it professionally. This reputation followed me throughout my time at that company and influenced how I was treated in performance reviews and promotion discussions. What I learned was that successful negotiation isn't about being aggressive or difficult. It's about being prepared to accept the consequences of walking away. When you genuinely have alternatives, you can negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. The other party can sense the difference immediately, and it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. The key was doing the homework up front to create real options, not just pretending I had them. Those 2 weeks of interviewing were crucial because they gave me actual data about my market value and genuine alternatives if this opportunity didn't work out. You can't fake that kind of confidence. It comes from knowing you have choices. I've used this same approach for everything from freelance project rates to apartment rent negotiations. The principle is always the same. Before entering any negotiation, create genuine alternatives so you're negotiating from choice rather than need. When people know you're willing and able to walk away, they take your requirements much more seriously. But understanding negotiation dynamics is just one piece of building the kind of life where people respect your boundaries. The bigger, challenge I faced was learning how to handle situations where people try to undermine your reputation or attack your character, especially in the digital age where these attacks can happen publicly and spread quickly. Machiavelli understood that public perception could be shaped by how you respond to attacks. Respond too much and you appear weak. Respond too little and you appear guilty. I never appreciated the wisdom of this balance until I found myself at the center of a social media controversy in late 2022 that threatened to destroy my consulting business and reputation. The experience taught me that digital age cruelty isn't about being harsh. It's about being strategically unresponsive to people who don't deserve your energy. It started when I posted a LinkedIn article about productivity habits that inadvertently offended someone in my network. The post mentioned that successful people typically wake up early and maintain consistent routines. A former colleague named Marcus took this personally and wrote a lengthy comment accusing me of being ableist and privileged for suggesting that morning routines were important. He tagged several mutual connections and claimed I was promoting toxic hustle culture. At first, I tried to be diplomatic. I responded with a clarification about how my advice was meant to be flexible and that everyone's circumstances are different. But Marcus wasn't interested in a reasonable discussion. He screenshot my response and posted it on Twitter with additional commentary about how I was doubling down on my supposedly problematic views. Suddenly, people I didn't even know were quoting my posts and adding their own criticisms. My initial instinct was to keep explaining myself, to provide more context, to show everyone that I wasn't the person Marcus was describing. I drafted several responses defending my character and clarifying my intentions. But then I remembered something I'd read about how Elon Musk handled similar situations. He would make one factual statement and then go completely silent, letting his critics exhaust themselves while he focused on actual work. I decided to post one final response. I appreciate the feedback on my article. My intention was to share strategies that have worked for me and many clients, not to prescribe universal solutions. I respect that everyone's situation is different. Then I stopped engaging completely. No responses to new comments, no attempts to defend myself further, no acknowledgement of additional attacks. This was harder than it sounds. For weeks, I felt the urge to correct mischaracterizations and defend my reputation. I watched as a few other people joined Marcus's criticism, and I had to resist the temptation to set the record straight. But I noticed something interesting happening. The conversation was starting to make Marcus look obsessive rather than righteous. Several of my actual clients and long-term connections began defending me without any prompting from me. They shared their positive experiences working with me and questioned why Marcus was so focused on attacking someone over a productivity article. Meanwhile, Marcus kept posting about the situation for weeks, which made him appear increasingly unhinged to anyone watching objectively. Within a month, the entire controversy had died down completely. Marcus moved on to attacking other people about different issues, which revealed his pattern of looking for things to be offended by. My business wasn't affected at all. In fact, I gained several new clients who appreciated how I'd handled the situation professionally without getting dragged into a public mud fight. The experience taught me that in the digital age, your response to criticism is often more important than the criticism itself. When you engage with every attack, you signal that your time and energy are available to anyone who wants to provoke you. When you respond once with facts and then ignore subsequent provocation, you demonstrate that you have more important things to focus on. What surprised me was how much this approach affected my overall relationship with social media. Instead of checking constantly to see if anyone had said something negative about me, I started posting my content and then focusing on actual work. The anxiety I didn't even realize I'd been carrying about online perception disappeared almost completely. I began applying this same principle to other digital interactions, not responding to every email immediately, not engaging with inflammatory comments on any platform, not feeling obligated to participate in every online discussion. It wasn't about being rude or antisocial. It was about being strategic with my attention and energy. The broader lesson was understanding that in our hyper-connected world, the ability to ignore provocation has become a crucial skill. People will test your boundaries online just like they do in person, and how you respond teaches them whether you're someone whose time and attention can be easily hijacked or someone who maintains focus regardless of distractions. But developing this kind of strategic detachment from digital drama was just one part of learning how to maintain authority and respect in all areas of life. The next challenge I faced required applying these principles to an even more complex situation involving leadership feedback and the psychology of helping people improve their performance. Machiavelli believed that a prince who fails to correct his subjects' errors becomes complicit in their failures and ultimately harms both the individual and the state. I learned exactly what he meant when I became Director of Product Development at a software company in Austin during 2023 and had to give the hardest feedback of my career to someone I genuinely cared about. The experience taught me that withholding honest criticism isn't kindness, it's a form of betrayal. Her name was Angela, and she'd been with the company for 3 years as a product manager. She was intelligent, hardworking, and well-liked by everyone on the team. But she had one critical flaw that was slowly undermining her effectiveness. She couldn't present ideas clearly to executive stakeholders. Her presentations were disorganized, she buried important points in unnecessary details, and she frequently lost the room during crucial decision-making meetings. For months, I'd been giving Angela what I thought was constructive feedback. I'd say things like, maybe we can tighten up the presentation structure, or let's work on making the key points more prominent. I thought I was being supportive and developmental, but Angela wasn't improving because my feedback was too vague and gentle to actually help her understand the severity of the problem. The breaking point came during a quarterly review meeting with the CEO and CFO. Angela was presenting our recommendation for a major product feature that could potentially generate $2 million in additional revenue. Instead of leading with the financial impact, she spent 15 minutes explaining technical implementation details that confused rather than convinced the executives. I watched their interest fade in real time. After the meeting, the CEO pulled me aside and said, "I'm concerned about Angela's ability to communicate strategic concepts effectively. This is the third presentation where I've struggled to understand her main points." I realized that my failure to give Angela direct feedback wasn't just hurting her career development. It was affecting the entire team's credibility and our ability to get important projects approved. That afternoon, I scheduled a one-on-one meeting with Angela for the next morning. I spent the evening preparing exactly what I needed to say because I knew that vague feedback would continue to fail her. I decided to follow the model I'd learned from studying companies with strong feedback cultures. Be specific, immediate, focused on behavior, and clear about consequences. I sat down with Angela and said, "Angela, I need to give you some direct feedback about your presentation yesterday. Your main recommendation got lost in technical details, and both the CEO and CFO told me afterward that they couldn't follow your logic. This pattern is affecting your credibility and our team's ability to get projects approved. We need to work on restructuring how you communicate with executives." Angela's initial reaction was shock and hurt. She thought the presentation went reasonably well, and she wasn't prepared for such direct criticism. But instead of getting defensive, she asked me what specifically she could do differently. That question told me she was ready to hear the truth and actually use it to improve her performance. Over the next 6 weeks, Angela and I worked together on her presentation skills. I gave her specific frameworks for structuring executive communications. We practiced delivering key points first, and I provided immediate feedback after each practice session. The improvement was dramatic and rapid once she understood exactly what needed to change. Her next quarterly presentation was a masterclass in executive communication. She led with the business impact, supported it with clear data, and finished with specific next steps. The CEO approved the project on the spot and complimented Angela's clear thinking and presentation skills. After the meeting, she thanked me for finally giving her feedback she could actually use to improve. What I learned was that most leaders avoid giving direct feedback because it makes them uncomfortable, not because it helps the employee. We tell ourselves we're being kind by softening our criticism, but we're actually being selfish, prioritizing our own comfort over the other person's professional development and success. The experience completely changed how I approached difficult conversations with my team. Now, when someone needs to improve in a specific area, I tell them exactly what they need to change, why it matters for their success, and what the consequences will be if the behavior continues. This approach has actually strengthened my relationships with direct reports because they know I'm invested in their growth rather than just avoiding conflict. But mastering the art of strategic firmness in leadership is only valuable if you understand the deeper rewards that come from building a life where people respect your boundaries and standards. The final lesson I learned was about how all these principles work together to create something much more powerful than just winning individual battles. Machiavelli observed that princes who apply cruelty well are ultimately more beloved than those who are constantly merciful because they create stability and predictability that people can trust. I never fully understood this paradox until I looked back on my own transformation over the past 5 years. From someone who avoided difficult decisions to someone whose word carries weight in every area of my life. The rewards of strategic firmness extend far beyond winning individual battles. When I started this journey in 2019, I was what you might call a people pleaser. I said yes to requests that drained my energy, avoided confrontations that needed to happen, and prioritized being liked over being respected. I thought I was being a good person, but I was actually training everyone around me to treat me as someone whose boundaries were optional and whose time wasn't particularly valuable. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with that first difficult decision to fire Dave from my startup team, continued through setting boundaries with my friend Mike, and evolved through dozens of smaller moments where I chose temporary discomfort over long-term problems. Each time I stood firm on a principle or standard, I felt like I was being harsh. But the cumulative effect was something I never expected. By 2023, people began approaching me differently. Colleagues started asking for my input on difficult decisions, knowing I'd give them honest feedback rather than telling them what they wanted to hear. Friends became more considerate about my time because they knew I wouldn't accept casual disrespect. Even family members began treating me with a level of regard that hadn't existed when I was constantly accommodating and flexible. What surprised me most was how this affected my romantic relationship with Sarah, who I'd been dating since early 2022. She told me that my willingness to have difficult conversations and maintain standards actually made her feel more secure in our relationship. She knew that when I said something, I meant it. And when I praised her or expressed appreciation, she could trust that it was genuine rather than automatic pleasantness. The professional rewards were even more dramatic. As a consultant, My rates increased by nearly 60% between 2021 and 2024, not because I became more skilled technically, but because clients began viewing me as someone who would tell them hard truths and help them make necessary changes. Companies started seeking me out specifically for situations that required honest assessment and decisive action. I realized I'd accidentally built something valuable, a reputation for reliability and straight talk that opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Investment opportunities came my way because people knew I'd evaluate deals honestly. Speaking engagements increased because event organizers wanted someone who would challenge their audience rather than just validate existing beliefs. But the most meaningful change was internal. The constant low-level anxiety I'd carried for years about whether people were taking advantage of me, whether I was being respected, whether I was living up to my own values, simply disappeared. When you consistently act according to clear principles, you eliminate the exhausting mental energy that goes into constantly adjusting your behavior based on other people's reactions. I thought about Roberto, a business owner I'd read about who spent 3 years avoiding tough personnel decisions until his company nearly collapsed. When he finally applied strategic firmness, letting go of 4 problematic employees in 1 month, his business transformed completely. Revenue increased 89% within 6 months. His remaining team became more productive and loyal, and he regained confidence in his leadership abilities. The pattern was unmistakable. Short-term discomfort from being firm led to long-term benefits for everyone involved. The employees Roberto kept were happier working with competent colleagues. The clients received better service. Roberto himself rediscovered his passion for running the business. Everyone won except the people who'd been underperforming and taking advantage of his previous reluctance to act. Looking back, I understand now what Machiavelli meant about being more beloved through well-applied firmness. People don't actually respect leaders who can't make tough decisions. They may like them in the moment, but they don't trust them with important matters. When you demonstrate that you'll do the right thing even when it's difficult, you earn a deeper level of respect that mere pleasantness can never achieve. The ultimate reward isn't power over others. It's freedom from the exhausting cycle of avoiding necessary conflicts and then dealing with the larger problems that avoidance creates. When people know you mean what you say and will follow through on your standards, most of the testing and boundary pushing simply stops happening. You end up having fewer difficult conversations, not more, because your reputation precedes you. These principles have given me something I never expected when I started studying Machiavelli. A life where my energy goes toward building and creating, rather than constantly managing problems I should have addressed earlier. That's the true reward of well-applied cruelty. The freedom to focus on what matters most because you've earned the respect that makes everything else easier.